There's another thing. I mean, I want to ask you about in the Chinese system. What is the role of, this is an issue in the United States about standardized tests and meritocracy. What is the role of standardized tests in Chinese admissions at universities? And then there's also, it's also has a role to play in the civil service. Can you talk a little bit about the role of these sort of psychometrics in Chinese government policy, or any kinds of tests that they use compared to the United States?
Well, it's interesting because they're not as into the kind of abstract psychometrics that in the United States, things like IQ measures and things like this that some Americans are focused on, but they are very invested in meritocracy. So the college entrance exam there is a monster test, and it's both a cognitive ability and in a sense, conscientiousness test, because you can't do well on that test unless you study very hard.
Mhm.
So even if in the United States, if you were a smart but lazy kid,
Yeah,
you
you
could
could
you
take
could
the
potentially,
SAT.
like,
Yeah, you can do very well.
especially in the old days when the ceiling on the SAT was super high, you could literally get a 1 in a million score on the SAT, and then people would look very seriously at your application, even if you had B's and
Yeah,
C's in your high school transcript, or even if you just dropped out of high school. But in China, it's not like that. You have to basically do well in this Gaokao, and the Gaokao is both a knowledge test and an ability test. So there are really hard problems on the Gaokao, but there are also lots of things where you just have to know a lot of stuff. So they're, in a way, they've not decomposed conscientiousness from raw G or cognitive ability the way that a U.S. psychometrician would think about
Mhm.
it. Um, However, they don't care,
Yeah,
and so they have this system that does. I mean, they have plenty of people, so they have plenty of talented people, so they are able to select very able people for their top universities. And furthermore, the Communist Party itself, the whole system of promotion within the Communist Party, this is not understood by most Americans, isn't is a very long time scale meritocracy.
Mm.
So anybody who reaches like the top level of, say, the top 300 people in the Communist Party has had to do things like, run a city with population of 10 million, or run a province which is the size of Germany. They had to do, and for example, famously, like, the current guy who is the boss of Zhejiang province was previously the head of the manned space program.
Yeah,
So there's actually circulation between different parts of government, not just like political governance, but also even technical development or major companies in China that are state owned. You might run or have a senior position at one of the state owned companies and then become a city manager or provincial governor. So all of these things are they're long time scale
uh-huh.
tests of your
Yeah,
capabilities. And it is real. I mean, when you meet the senior people there, again, they could be dull, lifeless, bureaucratic type people, but they are pretty able. They're not. No one says like, "Hey, I had a conversation with somebody from the Ministry of Finance in China, and they didn't actually understand how options pricing works." No, they actually do understand
yeah.
how options pricing work. Whereas people here at the Treasury or SEC often don't understand how options pricing works. So, anyway,
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's some data, that there's some political science papers where they actually show that you can connect objective performance as far as GDP growth to promotion, to promotions in China. So those that do well in like growth at the local level, mayors or province leaders or whatever tend to get promoted, and those that don't, tend not to. So there seems to be an evaluation system based on actual hard metrics. Um,
yeah.
and
And a lot of this is something that I'm not a super expert on this, but I'm very interested in this issue. So I'm always asking real China specialists, and typically, Chinese China specialists about this. Is that a lot of these functions, the idea of having bureaucrats that advance through good performance, and then having like actually a whole sub entity within the Communist Party which evaluates these, there's a whole separate
yeah,
independent entity that evaluates these people. And there's this whole tradition going back to imperial times of the idea that you have a core of bureaucrats. They're supposed to be extremely able. And furthermore, they're supposed to be monitored and measured for performance by an independent
right.
body, and all the subtleties of bribery. And, you should assign a guy from this region to run
Yeah,
that region, so he doesn't have a lot of local mafia connections locally. He's just a stranger from a totally different part of China, and he's got to run this
yeah,
thing, and he's going to be monitored over a 5-year time scale. That all those ideas are very old. They're not new ideas in China. They're old ideas. They're classical
yeah.
ideas. So So the idea that, oh, there's this communist party that's very brittle and it's a lot like
Yeah.
Stalin running the country is actually wrong. It's missing this whole
Yeah.
cultural, historical component of governance in China.
Yeah, the people who select and manage the sort of the cadre system, that's the Communist Party, right? So the Communist Party at one level up appoints the people at the level down, right? So it's like national and then
Yeah, but
provincial.
if you if you were to draw it like a kind of HR org chart functional diagram like you would have for like a company like Google or something, there is this pyramid where you're rising in the party, and to rise, you're talking about a 20, 30-year rise. Okay. Like you join the party when you're out of college and it takes you 30 years to become a senior official, right? So as you're rising in this pyramid, and the pyramid is getting smaller and smaller, like the base thing is like, I mean, the base of the Communist Party is 90 million people, right? So, but officials maybe have like a million people at this layer, but when you get to the top layer, it's an order of magnitude at each step. It's getting smaller. But the thing which people miss is there's a separate silo that you would draw over here, which is the evaluators, whose job it is to actually go around and investigate these guys and see, are they corrupt? What is actually happening in the city? Are the growth numbers faked? How did he raise the tax revenue? So there's this whole separate evaluative organization within the Communist Party, and so again, you could imagine it doesn't work well. Maybe there'll be periods of time that it is working well. I think it is probably working well right now.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating as sort of an alternative model of governance, because if China didn't exist, I don't know if we would think that a modern government could work like this. Because if you look at all the advanced states, they sort of look similar, right? The US, the UK, Japan, they have a civil service, they have elections, they have a market economy. And you might think this is what modernism is. This is the only way, that government can function at the end of history. And then you have China, and it's
So
just a completely different system, right? And so it's sort of it's a proof of concept that whatever we're doing, and if it's not working, that's pessimistic, because then you could say, we're going to be stagnating and there's no other possibility. It's at least a proof of concept that something different is possible.
So when the early contacts between European civilization and China were happening, people like Leibniz, the famous philosopher and mathematician, he was a huge fan of Chinese society and governance and all kinds of things. And so lots of ideas that were prevalent in China got popularized in countries like France and the UK. So if you actually ask, when did they start having examination systems for admitting people to Cambridge or top universities in UK and France? Turns out that was an adopted system from China. So you can actually find arguments in Parliament where some of the parliamentarians in the UK, in England, are complaining that this is an unnatural system. It's being adopted by China, and this is not how we should select students
Yeah.
for university or the civil
Mhm.
service. So even the civil service in these countries is somewhat modeled on, maybe they didn't have a really realistic idea of how it was being done in China, but they had the idea that there should be some kind of meritocracy, a competent bureaucracy. And so if you go back, it's actually, many of these ideas were actually imported to the West from China. So, but it is true what you say, that the system there is unique. It's quite different
Yeah.
from actually what they have.
Yeah, I did not know that. I didn't know that the history of standardized tests in the West actually came from China. That's accurate. So there wasn't was there anything resembling like a standardized test before the encounter with China?
No, in fact, the debates in Parliament are very interesting, because obviously there are a lot of people who are saying this is unnatural. This is some strange Chinese invention. Why we should not adopt it in England.
That's interesting. And the British were the British the first to do this? Did continental Europe have anything like that?
I'm not sure if they were actually the first, but there are people who have both in France and the UK or in England who have written about how this adoption of examination systems, entrance systems, came to be
Yeah.
adopted. And so you can find actually the historical
Do you,
documents.
do you have a reference for that so we can put it? We can put it in the
Yeah,
notes?
I have some blog posts on this. I'll send you the links.
Okay, great. And for people who want to read more about the Chinese system, do you have books or articles you particularly recommend?
That's a good question. You mean like the current system, how
Yeah, if
promotion
people just want
within
to
the
understand just how the whole thing works.
the best okay the most accessible discussions of this, there's a guy called Eric X Lee,
Mhm.
who's a venture capitalist in China, but he was educated at Berkeley, and he's very fluent in English, and so he's often been like a kind of apologist for the Chinese system. and like he gives TED talks and things like this, and sometimes he'll actually have slides showing exactly how the promotion
Yeah.
process works in the Chinese system. At a more kind of rigorous level, there's, I forgot his name now. There's a guy called, there's a American philosopher, political philosopher, who's now at, I think, Beijing University or Tsinghua University, and he
Bell is his name. It's called the China Model.
Bell, yes, Daniel Bell. Yeah, so Bell and his kind of circle, they've been writing a lot, I think, about a lot of these things. And so Bell, a lot of people in the West would say Bell is an apologist for the communist system, but at least you get some details of how he thinks it operates.
Yeah, I've read Bell's book. I think the detail is actually, I mean, it's a little bit of an apologist for the system, but it's from a political theorist perspective. So it's more sort of considering like the justness of it, and the, you know, then like if you just want sort of the details to understand. There's a
Yeah, Eric Lee is better for the actual details, like the actual diagram of how the whole thing works. Like you can find it in some of his talks.
And Lee is good. There's also there's a very accessible book by a Australian journalist, Richard McGregor, called The Party.
Yes.
That one's good too. And then there's a.
Now, I should say that we've kind of been painting it as a functional, kind of reasonably well high functioning system, but you can find many cynical Chinese who will just say like the party's totally corrupt, it's bullshit. Only private companies in China are the ones creating the value.
What's the Steelman? Yeah, what's the Steelman case for that? I think we've been given sort of a positive spin, because I think the media is actually more towards, you know, the system is corrupt and terrible. So, you know, I think it's good to have a counter to that. But what's the best argument for the other side?
You can find academic studies of, you know, the level of corruption in the Communist Party. In fact, sorry, I haven't looked at this in a while, but there's even a recent book about academic book by an American. She's of, I think, Chinese ethnicity, Chinese originally from China, but she's a professor here in the U.S. and she's studied corruption in China.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of Yun Ang, and I think she's actually at University of Michigan, so she's your neighbor. I don't know how close it is to Michigan State.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. You actually know this stuff because you're from your background's in political science.
Yeah.
So, it's tough to find really good sources. You know, obviously, if you read Chinese fluently, there's a much more diverse set of discussions about all the stuff that you can find. But I think I think the main thing, someone who's not in a position to spend a lot of time thinking about this and also has the linguistic capability to do it, you should just adopt a sort of low confidence perspective. Like, I'm not sure that the system, okay, there's some chance the system there is really messed up and it's fragile and brittle, but there's also a chance that actually for at least this period of time, like a few decades or a couple generations, they've got a functioning system that we should really take seriously, and it can actually get stuff accomplished. And I think there is evidence for the second thing, because, you know, they did build many, many kilometers of high-speed train, and they do have functioning, you know, nuclear weapons, and, you know, they did manage to do lots of stuff, right? So,
my preferred way of looking at it is, look, it's hard to like say in the abstract like how good the system is, right? It's just too hard of a question, and you don't have all the data, and you can't, you know, it's 1.4 billion people. I mean, like you can build a narrative that says anything. You know, I prefer just to look at hard metrics, right? I just like to look at GDP growth. I just like to look at living standards. I like to look at, you know, expectations of what's going to happen to the Chinese system versus, you know, what's actually happened, and then, you know, sort of take a, you know, sort of a black box view and say, okay, whatever, if it looks like the outputs are good, it's probably working, right? And then, like, you know,
it's also true that there's no substitute for having a very long time scale over which you're carefully observing what happens. So I had exactly this kind of argument or discussion with a couple of colleagues who are Americans but were living in China at the time, and this is about 10 years ago. And at the time, the pollution level in Beijing was just unbelievably bad. Like, you would go there and like there were days where you'd just be hacking, and and so one of the things one of my colleagues said, and this guy's an incredibly smart guy, he just said, and he had been living in Shenzhen, he said, look, here's a good test for these guys. They have every incentive to clean up the pollution problem in Beijing because the elites actually are there, and it's giving them a bad reputation internationally. So let's just see how fast they clean up the air quality in Beijing. And they actually have. Now the air quality in Beijing is quite good. So, or at least much, much better than it was 10 years ago. So on that particular prediction metric, they did seem to do what they set out to do.
You compare it to Washington, D.C., and, you know, look at the sort of, people are saying it's getting worse in recent years with crime and the homeless encampment. So you'd think it's the same logic.
Or the metro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
the infrastructure, everything. And you'd think it'd be the same logic, but apparently we can't make Washington D.C. presentable. So that might tell you something, yeah, about our own.
Yeah, no, that's a good test.
Yeah, exactly.